I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from journalist Michael Fox of The Real News to discuss last month's BRICS summit, which he reported on. In Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, we'll be talking about what exactly the BRICS is and its dream of countering U.S. economic hegemony. We'll also talk about the presence of Brazilian President Lula da Silva at the BRICS summit and much, much more. So without any further ado, let's get right to it with Michael Fox. Welcome to Parallax Views. A guest that I was just telling him I've wanted to have him on before, and now I thought this is the opportunity. I'm talking with journalist Michael Fox, who has two really great podcasts, Stories of Resistance and Under the Shadow, which I believe you can listen to at The Real News, run by our friend Max Alvarez. How are you doing, Michael Fox?
Doing fantastic. Thanks so much for having me on.
So the reason I wanted to have you on was you were recently reporting on the BRICS summit. You wrote a piece in The Real News just yesterday, I believe. It was published, entitled, "Why is Donald Trump Afraid of the BRICS?" But before we get to that, if people don't know what we're talking about, what is BRICS?
Good question. So BRICS was founded in 2009. Originally, it's a trade bloc of the most powerful developing nations, right? So you had Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And that's what it was like for roughly the last year or two. I mean, until about a year or two ago. A year or two, they expanded. So now there's 10 different partner countries. So as well as Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and South Africa, you now have Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates, and then Saudi Arabia is kind of like maybe we're in, maybe we're not. And then they just brought in another 10 associate countries. The two major ones for Latin America are Bolivia and Cuba. But there's been, just a ton of other countries, including Turkey and Thailand and Malaysia and Vietnam and Algeria. And then during this summit, that you had a bunch of other observer nations, right? So you had Chile, Colombia, and Uruguay. They were also involved. So it's a huge trade bloc. It was founded to kind of counter the hegemony of the United States, the EU, the G7 in the world, and create almost like the idea of really pushing for a multipolar world where developing nations have a voice in kind of the world global system. So it's been really important, and it's been increasingly important, particularly just in these last couple of years.
So Donald Trump recently referred to BRICS as anti-American, the anti-American policies of BRICS, and he's calling for an additional 10% tariff on the BRICS nations. Why is Trump so afraid of BRICS?
So this is great, and I love the fact that Trump is like, literally the conference wasn't even over when Trump said, "Oh, I'm going to slap you guys an extra 10% tariff." It's crazy. To understand this, we go back a little bit more. The 10% tariff is actually small compared to what Trump has been threatening, right after he was elected late last year, he threatened a 100% tariff on all of the BRICS countries. And then he reiterated the same thing right after he came into office. And the main thing for him, of course, he doesn't like people, trying to build a more multipolar system, pushing for more democratic system in the world, pushing against the United States. The BRICS condemned during the summit itself, they condemned unilateral monetary measures, which of course was the United States, like clearly looking at the United States and Trump's tariff measures. And they also condemned the war and the violence in Gaza and Iran. But the big thing that Trump is upset about and angry about and concerned is de-dollarization. So that is basically where the dollar, which has been the reserve currency since the end of World War II, and this is when the dollar stops being the world currency and countries then move to be trading on their local currencies or in other currencies around the world. And this is one of the things that the BRICS is definitely moving in the direction toward. They mentioned it several times in the final document, moving toward local currencies and trading in local currencies. And in fact, Putin actually mentioned this as well. He said, look, we have to move toward an interstate system where we can trade amongst our own countries through this other financial system. Trump does not like this. Of course, the more that you move the countries of the world and the global market away from the US dollar, the less support than the dollar and the less financial backing the dollar needs. Remember, the United States has a tremendous foreign debt in the trillions, but it's able to have the foreign debt and not have insane inflation because of the fact that everyone uses the dollar as the reserve currency in the world. Once you move away from that, then things start to get a little bit concerning. And currently, right now, I guess just over half of all international trade is done in the dollar. But the BRICS countries, which basically makes up about roughly half the population of the planet, are moving away from that. Dilma Rousseff, who's the president of the BRICS New Development Bank, which is a bank that the BRICS created, kind of like the International Development Bank, but this is specifically for the BRICS. Right now, she said that they're at about 25% in local currencies. By next year, they want to move toward 30%. So it's a process. This is not going to happen overnight. But obviously, Trump does not like that. They didn't mention Trump or the United States in their declarations. They didn't mention him over the weekend. It was like a non-starter. They didn't talk about it at all. But clearly, the United States is always kind of it's got the all of the countries are looking to move away from that. Where the United States wants to be the hegemon in the world, the BRICS countries want it to be democratic, and that's Trump doesn't like that.
If you could, and we'll talk about your experiences at the summit, but before that, do you think there's any misunderstandings people have about BRICS that need to be maybe dismissed? Because I think, I think people have to understand it's not like a military thing. It's very much about economics is the main focus. And I think there's other aspects that people may not understand about BRICS or, I even had people say for years, well, BRICS isn't that important. It's not a big thing. What are the sort of myths and realities of BRICS?
This is a really great question. Because that is, you think of BRICS, you think, oh, they must be trying to unite to defend whatever else, or like you said, like what's the big deal? So look at it like this, and Lula talked about this in his very first speech, Sunday morning, July 6th, the very first day of the summit, and he said, look, we are the legacy of the non-aligned movement. So that's the vision. That's what the BRICS see themselves as, right? The BRICS countries. Whereas the non-aligned movement were the countries during the Cold War that said, look, we don't need the United States or we don't need Russia, and we are going to, carve our own path, and we don't need this. The BRICS is saying very much the same thing. We need to unite as developing countries in the world, and we should have a say in global politics and global policies. If you look at what the reality is with the G7, these are all the most powerful countries in the world, the G20, the most powerful countries in the world. When is it that, I don't know, Ethiopia or Egypt, where do they have a say, right, within the global system? And this is something else that the BRICS has been really pushing for in recent years, is the reform of the UN and saying, look, why is it that the UN Security Council right now has 5 countries that have veto power, and apparently these are the most powerful countries at the end of World War II. But why is it still like that? Isn't the whole idea is that we need more democracy and more democratic opinion from the countries in the world? So this is something else that Lula brought up during the weekend, saying, look, other countries are allowed to be involved and should be involved in the decisions that are made over their people. It's the same thing. Like imagine, within we're talking on a global scene, but within one country, imagine it was like five people or five groups of people that got to decide everybody, and voting didn't really exist. Well, the BRICS are saying no, we all should have a say. So this is just, I mean, a tiny piece of why it's important. At the very end, the final declaration, there was 126 resolutions they came out with, and these were really broad. It is an economic bloc, but they're talking about, how are we combating climate change? How are we ensuring that artificial intelligence is in the hands of everybody, and it's shared equitably amongst all the different countries, and that we all have access. And as Lula mentioned also, it's not just in the hands of the billionaires, right? So that's really kind of key to where this is happening. They talked about how are they combating world hunger? How do we try and work toward more peaceful mediation of conflict resolution around the world? How do we stop wars abroad? And of course, how do we also move to support our own countries and our own local currencies? So it's a wide range of different things. When we talk about the BRICS, this is really huge. And one of the really key things, I spoke to a lot of analysts while I was there in Rio de Janeiro. In fact, the BRICS Policy Center is actually based in Rio de Janeiro. They're constantly looking at what BRICS means in the world. One of the women who I spoke with, who's basically like the environmental coordinator for the BRICS Policy Center, her name is Maureen Santos, and she said, "Look, this is the only bloc that's pushing in the world to create change on a multinational level, and the bloc that's the closest to being actually to be able to implement change in this space, because all the rest of the countries, they have no interest, right? The United States, Europe, the Western nations, they don't necessarily have interest in, oh, we have to more, democratize multinational policy and democratize the world like that. They don't have a vested interest in that. Why? Because they're the ones who are actually in power, whereas the BRICS countries are actually trying to change things on an international level. So it's huge on that level. And absolutely from like a US perspective and within the United States, obviously there was some news on it. It's kind of covered, but it's not. Almost a non-starter. And Trump's wants it like that, right? In fact, his tweets like almost at midnight on Sunday night, halfway through the conference, was also a way to kind of redirect like the conversation around the BRICS and what they're doing and how they're trying to push, and condemning Gaza and condemning the attack on Iran, and steer it in his own direction, right? He's gonna take control of it. Literally, the press conference the following afternoon with Lula, the first three or four questions were all about Trump. And this is this is an international conference of 26 different countries where Lula has overseen this thing. It's huge. And all the press want to know is how, what's up with Trump, and how are the BRICS going to retaliate and whatever else. So like that type of level of thing is also the way of derailing the conversation about kind of what are the most important issues and what they're talking about. And Lula responded to those questions of saying, basically, I shouldn't even respond. We don't need an emperor in the world. We don't want an emperor. We're sovereign nations. And frankly, we're going to continue to do what we're going to continue to do, and we're going to stay the course. And Trump can do whatever the hell he wants. Like I don't care. That's not what the conversation was about. And in fact, he even said after Trump tweeted out those tweets on Sunday night, the following day in the conference, we didn't mention that once. It wasn't an issue. And so this is why the BRICS is so important. The one other thing, JG, that I really want to talk about is the Popular Council. Now, this is a new thing they created
I
just
wanted
over
to
the
ask
last
you about the
year.
Popular Council, but go on. I'm sorry.
Awesome, fantastic. Because this is big. Like, and you can't imagine this in any other kind of international forum like this. It's basically almost like the World Social Forum was to the World Economic Forum, which happened about, 20 years ago. But instead of it being an independent council itself, the whole idea is that social movements from all the different countries and civil society and academics come together. They then kind of make recommendations, and they develop ideas, and they develop policies that then they bring to the leaders of the BRICS nations. So they had a whole 2-day forum on the 2 days before the summit where, different social movements, how homeless movements, the MST, the world's largest, or at least the largest social movement in the Americas, right? They were extremely present and really important. And so they developed their own kind of ideas, initiatives, brought those together. And then on the first day of the summit, they actually brought that to the summit leaders. So it's an idea of having a way for grassroots movements and social movements to be able to participate in kind of the direction of the BRICS and the direction of policies and stuff, which is this is pretty radical. I mean, for an international forum, particularly an international forum that, the thing, JG, that the BRICS, it's not just these aren't radical revolutionary all of left countries. Like, we're talking about very diverse countries, some of them that aren't necessarily so democratic. And the idea that they're having this space to be able to have participation from civil society is really huge. So this was the very first year that they kind of began it in Russia last year. That's when it was kind of kicked off. But this was the first full year where they've been doing kind of meetings and talks all throughout the year and then delivered those proposals to the BRIC nations on the first day of the summit.
I'm curious, and this is sort of outside of the summit, but one of the things that comes up with BRICS, and I see people that will be skeptical of BRICS, or they'll want to write it off because they'll say, well, I don't like this country that is involved with BRICS. Let's say it's Russia or, India with Modi. Why do you think it's a mistake to completely write off BRICS just because, well, maybe I disagree with this country, even though I like Brazil and Lula?
This is another really great question. The reason is that BRICS is working on kind of the whole idea with BRICS is we come together to build a multinational kind of movement that can push for our interests as developing nations around the world. But look, I'm not going to get involved in kind of the inter workings within your country. I'm not going to criticize or critique what's happening within your country. That's your sovereign nation, right? And this is really, really clear. And it's important to have this space where we can be talking about, revamping and reforming, for instance, the UN from a more democratic way, regardless of what the countries are involved. I think what happens so much, JG, in politics, and particularly foreign policy politics, and particularly like from the left perspective of, oh, that country's bad, or they do that and they do that, and let's throw out the baby with the bathwater and it's all done. The BRICS is saying, and you saw this, Lula is standing next to Modi, and he's obviously Putin wasn't there, nor neither was Xi Jinping from China, but he's standing against with all these other leaders saying, look, we are going to come together, and I'm not going to get involved and mess with the sovereignty of your nation. That's your deal. But we do have to reform things on an international level, and we do have to stand up to the United States and the European countries and the G7, and we do need to democratize the way things are done in the world. It's real. That's really not that hard. And if you look at what the policies and the resolutions they came out with within this final document, some of this is I mean, you're not seeing this from the United States, right? This is the only forum, and a lot of people talked about it, where everyone's coming together on the whole idea of it, at least, is that everyone's coming together on a horizontal level to discuss, to have conversations, to figure out how to take steps going forward. Whereas so often in these international, groups, you're seeing, the United States or these groups are kind of manhandling these people to do these things and to say these things. Israel is joining the United States to stand up against the UN resolution against the US blockade against Cuba and whatnot. So you always see this like this kind of politicking, but with force. The same thing is like exactly what Trump likes. And the whole idea of the BRICS is that no, we're all on an equal level, and regardless of what the different countries' issues are politically or the different governments, we're going to try and find a way to advance together. And this is powerful. And it's not, this is a really important point. A lot of people think of the summit as, oh, it's the BRICS summit, and everyone goes home, just like the whatever, the G7, whatever else. The BRICS, what they talked about is they had roughly 300 meetings going into in order to develop negotiations around all these different issues to decide what would be in these documents, decide how they would then go forward. And that's just over the last year. And now, literally, the summit's over, and it's not the end, but it's the beginning again of the same process looking toward, next year, because they have a summit each year. This is powerful. And, this is happening with negotiators on a really, really local level. They call them Sherpas, who are basically the people who get the, okay, here's your 126 resolutions, and go forth and figure out how we're going to make these things happen, and then figure out what the next plans are for the next documents of the next year. So it is absolutely worthwhile. The contradictions are real, like they mentioned, for instance, Ukraine in the document, saying like we need to push for a more mediated, final resolution to this conflict. But of course, Russia's involved in there, and so this is the negotiators that are on the local level, discussing about how they're going to come up with different narratives and what are the language going to be around these things. It cannot be easy, but it is still extremely important, even if there are some countries in there that you might not like or
Would you
some
say that
policy.
it's the BRICS is trying to? I would say that like any other organization, it's navigating. Well, all these countries have their own individual interests, but then they also have areas where they can cooperate. And I
Yeah.
think that they're just an organization trying to like hit that balance, so to speak.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And can you imagine? I mean, I personally I can't imagine what that balance must look like amongst the 11 partner countries. And then when you bring in the associate countries, we're talking about 20 different countries, and they're all trying to find this balance of what's good for me, what's good for you, and still pushing and including, an agenda trying to battle climate change and an agenda trying to battle, hunger and trying to, push for to ensure that all these countries have access to health, right? Which is something that's so important around the world. So it is absolutely a balance. And of all the people this year's summit was interesting because of all the people that could be kind of navigating that balance on the planet is Lula, right? He is like the personification of the diplomat who's more than willing to speak with the U.S. president, and he's also gonna, stand up and back at least in the in the 2000s Hugo Chavez, whatever else. So it's this is it is a really interesting balance.
I was wondering if you could delve more into that because I think Lula is sort of this unifying figure for a lot of people, especially on the left. I mean, I used to be friends with Michael Brooks, who was a big backer of Lula, and I think Lula has a certain currency with people in both the global South and even amongst Western leftists. I mean, he is a really unifying figure. What do you think about what he had to say at the BRICS, and how? What do you think it's telling that he was so central to this summit?
Well, so this is the fourth BRIC summit that they had in Brazil. Is the second under Lula, and he was very clear. He came out in the very, very beginning saying, "This is the most important summit yet because of the world stage that we're living in with wars and just everything seems like it's being flipped upside down." So absolutely having this in Brazil and having Lula be front and center was really, really key. There were a couple things that I found interesting. So at the summit itself, we were only able to hear the speeches from Lula. So Lula would kick off the speeches in the round of kind of talks of the different countries. So we would hear that would be televised, the press, and then all the rest of it we don't know what they said. And then we'd go to the second round, which would be about climate change, and the third round, which would be about artificial intelligence. And each of these, we would hear Lula speaking, which he is such a unifying figure. He is so key, and he has been, I mean, since the very, very beginning. And so, I mean, that was one of the things in the summit. I wish we had been able to hear more from other people. We know what Putin said because that was televised by live stream, and then they must have put it out on Russian TV and whatever else like that. So we were able to hear what Putin had to say later on, in particular around the question of de-dollarization. But no, absolutely, Lula is central to this, and particularly right now, there couldn't have been a better president. And it wasn't, this was, I mean, it was kind of by accident. It was Brazil's term. And of course, if Bolsonaro was in power, I don't even know if they would have held the summit. Would he have tried to, pull out of the BRICS, whatever else, because he hates these international groups like this. But regardless, having Lula there was key. He is this unifying figure so much, and he always has been. I mean, that's one of the things that's incredible is, he represents, probably the greatest labor leader and the greatest leftist leader that Brazil has ever seen, right? And at the same time, he's not the leader that is going to go, oh, I'm not going to talk to you, and we're going to do this, and we're going to, and he's more than willing to get into these negotiations with people from anywhere. But at the same time, he's also more than willing to defend Brazil. Like right now, I guess it was about a week ago that Trump slapped Brazil with this 50% tariff, basically because Brazil is has this case against Jair Bolsonaro, former President Jair Bolsonaro, for an attempted coup, and for actually within that attempted coup, there are accusations from the federal police that he wanted to kill Lula, kill Lula's vice president, and kill one of the members of the Supreme Court. So this is huge. This is a very big thing. And Trump, because Bolsonaro is an old friend of Trump, said, no, 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 you can't do that. You got to stop the trial against Bolsonaro. So essentially, he levied this 50% tariff on Brazil, and Lula's totally responded. But he's responded, he's look, if you're going to do that, we're going to do it back. But like, let's find other ways of coming together and to negotiate, whatever else. So, Lula is the antithesis of Trump in so many ways. Trump
I
is this
was gonna,
hothead.
I was just gonna add to that, not to, but it
Yeah, go
is
for it.
interesting to me. It's interesting to me because you know, it, Lula da Silva even had, I would say fairly good relations during the Biden administration with the
Yeah.
U.S., which I think shows his ability to like bridge a lot of gaps. And now that's all been thrown out of the window with Trump. It's very interesting to me how we went from, I think there was a relation cultivated between the U.S. and Brazil during the Biden years. That was actually quite good compared to what we had before, and now that's all been thrown out the window by Trump.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, because for Trump, Lula is this leftist, crazy, whatever else, and Trump is a bully, right? He doesn't want negotiations. He doesn't want mediation. He doesn't want a diplomat. He wants to push people around, and that's where he's coming back to. The other question of that we've seen that Trump also said was wrapped into his 50% tariff was the fact that the Supreme Court in Brazil came out and said that social media platforms are responsible for the content that is published on those social media platforms. Of course, Trump doesn't like this at all. Musk, his connections with all of the social media heads right out in California and Silicon Valley. This is like those are fighting words, right? And so that's the other reason why Trump says, but it is sad. Of course, we've seen that with U.S. relations with almost every country. Like Trump is just trampling everything and destroying everything. But Lula is, he's doing his best to keep it real and to ensure that maybe hopefully tariffs don't go into effect on August 1st.
Yeah, and I wanted to say just so people are clear, I wasn't trying to like say if that wasn't like a defense of Biden. It was more so talking about how Lula is able to like interact with the U.S. in reasonable ways when he's not dealing with Trump. Um,
That's right. That's
I
right.
think what's really interesting about this article, I know you only mention them once in this article, but maybe you could talk about the BRICS New Development Bank and former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. How central are they to all of this?
I mean, they're pretty key. The new development bank, it hit 10 years, so it had its 10-year anniversary just a couple days before the BRICS summit. And the whole idea is let's break from the international lending system, the International Monetary Fund, and these massive where they're gonna make us do things, right? They're gonna make us privatize certain aspects of our countries and whatever else, which is just destroyed so much of Latin America and the developing nations over the last 20 or 30 years. And let's find a new way of lending money, and let's find a new way of doing development projects. And in a way that is, south-south, in a way that is actually supportive and not like demanding that the countries do stuff because I want them to do things, because I want my corporations to push in and to make more money off of these countries. That has just destroyed the region, right? Since the neoliberal beginning of the 1990s, whatever else on. And that's the whole idea of this new development bank. We're going to say, no, let's do this in a different way. And part of that, like I mentioned before, is being able to use local currencies in order to do these lending projects and to break from the hegemony of the US dollar. The fact that Dilma, and she's been the head of this bank for a couple of years, but the fact that she's the head of the bank, I think is really powerful because she is also such a kind of mediator. She's not as charismatic as Lula, obviously. She's not Lula, but because of what she represented, of course, the coup against her in 2016, the fact that she's at the head of the bank and is able to make these connections, already has all these connections with all these different countries is really key.
Now, in terms of Trump's threats of tariffs in response to BRICS, how likely is it that BRICS countries will stay the course? If the economic cost becomes very real with these threatened tariffs.
And what I got from this summit is that no one is going to bow to Trump from at least from these nations. The BRICS entity itself and the BRICS trading, the BRICS, um, you know, the BRICS group itself is more important than Trump slapping his 10% tariffs, and also because Trump makes so many threats all the time. Like, oh, you guys, it's a 60% threat, it's 100%, 10%. So like he comes out and he makes these threats and then he rolls it all back. It's like everyone uses this analogy, but it's a schoolyard bully who pushes people around and then, and makes him feel good. So I don't see his tariffs having any impact whatsoever on the movement, on the actions, and on the future of the BRICS countries themselves, particularly not in their kind of organizing with the BRICS. We're not going to see countries leaving the BRICS because Trump is threatening a 10% tariff, and particularly not these countries. We're talking, so much of these countries, these are powerful developing nations, and particularly in the case of China and Russia, it's like, yeah, whatever, do what you want to do. Then we're going to do our own thing. I think one of the big things that come out of it that I really felt from the BRICS leaders and from the summit itself is that the more that Trump pushes, the more he's then shooting himself in his own foot because he's pushing the BRICS countries away and actually incentivizing them to de-dollarize, to push for their own currencies, to do things even more antagonistically, to the United States, even though they weren't, they didn't mention the US. We're not going to mention these things. That's not the idea. It's like we're gonna turn the other cheek. I don't think we're going to see BRICS nations, peeling off from this because they're concerned about, Trump's tariffs. We might see if it develops further and there is actually much more of increased push to de-dollarize. I can imagine that Trump might try to increase those tariffs, and then might get trickier. But the 10% tariff isn't going to impact these countries because what they get from the BRICS, entity and what get from the BRICS group itself is so much more than they would, get from or then they'd be penalized from a Trump tariff like that.
It's interesting you mentioned multipolarity and the emerging multipolar system, which I think that's just a fact that we're emerging into multipolarity. And I think there's a lot of promise in that because I think the unipolar moment with the US at the helm, there's been, I mean, to put it mildly, a lot of problems with it. And I would say a lot of inequality. That said, I think that the emergent multipolarity has to be approached correctly. It's not necessarily, multipolarity doesn't necessarily mean like a utopia, but I think that BRICS can offer a way forward for multipolarity that could potentially be more fair. What role do you think BRICS will play in shaping the multipolar moment that we're emerging into?
Yeah, so the, the first thing that everyone talked about, and I mentioned it already a little bit, is this question of kind of really trying to revamp the UN, right? Like saying like, look, we need the Security Council needs to change. We need other countries. We need all of this to be democratized. And that like of all of the questions in terms of multipolarity and in terms of like international governance, that was the thing that just people just kept coming back to and back to and back to and back to because that's like that is the entity in the world that is like the epitome of what international governments is, and it's failing, right? It is literally now more than ever, it's completely paralyzed on Gaza, like it is not working. And so the BRICS countries really see themselves as trying to push to revamp that system and change things, from within the UN. The question is and in fact, the general director of the UN was at the BRIC summit here in Brazil. So that's kind of a sign of how important the BRICS could potentially, of how important a role they could potentially play. On other levels, this is what the BRICS are trying. The question, JG, is exactly, you know, how is this going to play out in the next 5, 10, 15 years? There is no other kind of international group, multinational group like this that is trying to push on this level to really create a more multipolar world. And we see that kind of international governments right now is just not working. And the hegemony of the United States continues. And that's the way that Trump wants it. So Trump's going to push back as much as however much he possibly can. That's why we see the tariffs. That's why we see not just the tariffs on the BRICS countries or on Brazil, but on so many countries in the world, because Trump is trying to play this game where he is the one in power. This is how Trump gets everyone's attention always, right? He's like, I'm going to do this, and then it's shock and awe, and then everybody, it's all about Trump, like all the news about Trump. And that's what he wants, and that's his kind of his way of trying to keep the attention on himself and trying to keep the United States in power. But the more he does that, the more people break away. And I think this is actually an opportunity more than ever before. I think this is an interesting moment where having the BRICS like this and having Trump in office, we're going to see the potential creation of more space for kind of the multipolarity in the world.
I want to dig down on that you said you mentioned international governance there. That's sort of where I was going with this is that I mean you could have a version of multipolarity where countries just say, well, we sort of don't want to bother with other countries and their spheres of influence, and we just that's their sovereign territory. That isn't what this is, though. This is saying that in part, but it's also calling for cooperation, like you said, international governance. So I think it's an approach to multipolarity that is as much about cooperation as sovereignty.
Oh, absolutely. And those two things have to go hand in hand. The sovereignty in the sense that, look, like for instance, Brazil, we have a trial against our former president because he attempted a coup. Trump, I'm sorry, you can't like, slap 50% tariffs on us saying that you want to tell our justice system what it's supposed to do. That's our sovereign right. So that's the right of these different countries to do what they need to do within their countries. But they absolutely are, the question of cooperation, the question of governance on a more democratic or more horizontal level in the world is extremely important for these nations. And the top issue, JG, that they talked about so much, Lula talked about it, it was front and center, is Gaza. Right now, international governments is completely failing, right? The genocide is happening and no one's doing anything about it. And that's really key for these countries to say, no, that can't continue. So on that level of like cooperation, we need to find other channels of other ways to come together. The other thing that was that was key, obviously, because Iran is one of the BRICS partner nations, was the question of is Israel's attacks on Iran, the United States attacks on Iran. They didn't go into in depth in it, but it was definitely mentioned. Lula brought it up that this can't happen, and they brought it up in the final declaration. These types of things cannot happen. So no, those two things have to go hand in hand. In the one sense, the sovereignty of each country, but also like how do we work together on an international sphere, which is not it's not happening right now. Right now, it's all about Trump in the United States, and they're saying no, that's not the way it's supposed to go.
How important do you think it is that BRICS isn't necessarily, it's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater in the sense of it's not trying to throw out internationalism. I think that the US is filled in a lot of ways with it will talk about international law, but then not, as we see with Gaza, actually abide by it. It'll give it sort of lip service, but not really care about it. That doesn't mean, though, that we have to throw the idea of internationalism or international cooperation out the window. And I think that's an important part of BRICS because this isn't some simple, like, it's not nationalist, it's internationalist in tone. How important do you think that is?
Oh no, it's key. Like that is the basis of this, right? Of saying no, we need to find ways to work together and to come together on an international sphere. That is no that I mean that's the basis of what the BRICS summit was about, and what the BRICS has meant since 2009. And I think this is really key because kind of going back to what we were talking about before, JG, where usually the BRICS is seen as, oh, it's this economic bloc and they do some economic stuff and they try and like yeah, the economy is one piece of this. But if you look at that final declaration, these like I mentioned, they're talking about health, they're talking about climate change, they're talking about artificial intelligence, they're talking about all these different things that are really important for these different countries and about organizing and working forward on an international level and on an international sphere. How do we take our our vision for the world forward, right? As this kind of joint block. And I think it's part of the reason why they expanded. I've been trying to understand this. Like if you're the BRICS nations a couple years ago, you're already powerful developing nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Why expand? And part of that was they talked about, look, we want to incorporate other countries. Like we want to be the space for other countries to be involved in and to have these conversations. And of course, to have even more of the world's global economy and more of the world's population involved in having these discussions on a more horizontal playing sphere. So that's part of the reason for the expansion itself. And the fact that there were 26 different countries at this summit, I think, is really huge and talks to how much they wanted to include and how much they are being inclusive of, the different nations in the world.
Yeah, and I think that's the important point is that this isn't a bunch of nations saying, well, we need to stand up for just going back into like pure nationalism, and everyone just sort of keeps to themselves. I mean, there is this recognition of the need for cooperation between nations while respecting sovereignty. And I'm sorry I keep reiterating that, but it's a very interesting sort of dynamic to me.
Well, and this goes back to the legacy of the non-aligned movement. Again, like when I heard Lula mention that, I'd heard other people mention it, but again, he said that within the first 5 lines of his first speech, which shows how important that legacy is for him and the other countries that are involved. Of again, it's not like we can't just hide. It's not just, oh, I'm in my little nationalist world and I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. That doesn't work anymore on the global sphere. Everybody's trading commerce. You can't just this is a space where people come together to try and look for solutions on an international sphere together, international solutions, right? As all these different countries in the world. And this is really key. And like I mentioned, it's not just the summit where they pay lip service to it and then they're like, okay, now everyone goes home. We'll see you next year. It's a constant process whereby people are working toward this and negotiating around these things and trying to put these things into implementation throughout the year, which I think is pretty key.
Do you think I find it interesting that Lula referenced the non-aligned movement because I think that implies that I'm not sure BRICS is looking to like overthrow like the global system or global capitalism, or even like it's not even trying to like overthrow the US so much as it's trying to create a parallel alternative.
Yeah, yeah, it is interesting. I wouldn't necessarily say it's trying to create a parallel alternative. I think it's trying to create the space for the developing countries to be able to work and organize and push for their policies together, um, and at the same time push to reform global governance, on an international level. So, and in the one sense, it's like we're going to do our thing over here. We're going to do our thing regardless of what the U.S. and the G7, whatever else, are going to do. And also, it's important to remember that it doesn't mean, oh, you're involved in the BRICS, so you can't have relations with the United States, or you can't be involved in the G7 or G20 or whatever.
Well, that's what I mean. I don't think it's contrary to what Trump is saying. I'm not sure that's actually an anti-US bloc.
Oh no, and people at the BRICS would never say that because it's not about the United States. It's about themselves. It's about how do we come together and organize as, developing nations. Of course, again, this goes back to this question of the United States wants it all to be about the United States, and it's good PR to call it an anti-American bloc. And of course, when the BRICS was founded, it was founded to create kind of another balance of power in the world, saying, okay, the United States, Western nations, G7, you guys always decide everything. Well, look, we are really powerful developing nations, and we want to have a say in the global sphere as well. But it's not, oh, we're going to attack Trump or we're going to attack the United States. No, we're going to defend ourselves, and we're going to stand up against things that we don't see are being fair or implemented by Trump on an international sphere. But it's not an anti-American. Of course, that PR works for Trump, right?
I hope this isn't too outside the scope of your article, but if we were to look beyond Trump, and this is also not necessarily about BRICS itself, but more about the U.S. response, how might a different U.S. administration engage with BRICS? Like, would it be possible to cooperate instead of confront, or are there different ways of the U.S. Dealing with BRICS that are contrary to how Trump is dealing with it?
This is so great, JG. And of course, there's different ways. The United States has dealt with BRICS in different ways over the last, since it was founded in 2009. The response doesn't have to be to, name call and then slap a 10% tariff on it. There are other ways of being able to relate with this. Regardless, I think the United States is concerned. The United States sees BRICS as a threat. In
A
particular,
challenge to its
Trump, a
hegemony.
challenge. Exactly. That's the point. So regardless of, if obviously Biden related differently with BRICS, other countries, Obama, of course, Obama, ever say, guys, we're related differently with BRICS. But it is still a challenge to the United States because the US is the hegemon. The United States has the most powerful military. The US wants to do what it wants to do. It doesn't want to have other people, kind of splitting off and making their own group and doing their own thing that's going to make, and pulling their money switching to use different reserves and things like that. So it is a challenge, but you can do this diplomatically, right? You can do this in ways in which, if we were in a different space where you actually had like a benevolent leader in the United States who wanted world governance and wanted to go from a place of U.S. hegemony toward a place of a more multipolar world where we can all kind of come together and make decisions more democratically in the world, then you would obviously see. No, you wouldn't have a representative necessarily of the United States at the summit because that's something that the BRIC countries don't want. But you would see much more kind of benevolent negotiations and relations with these different countries. Of course, that's never going to be the direction that Trump is going to take.
What was the atmosphere like on the ground at the BRICS summit? Did you get a sense of urgency or optimism among delegates and observers?
A lot of optimism. Also, a lot of concern right now because the world is just upside down, right? And this was the first summit that Putin and Xi Jinping didn't like weren't actually present there. Um, Putin didn't go because there's arrest warrant out for his arrest, right, with the ICC criminal court. And Xi Jinping, we don't really know. I thought it was interesting that leading into the summit, before I dive into the summit itself, leading into the summit, this was like what everyone talked about was like, oh, the BRICS summit is coming. Oh, but it's not going to be that great because, Russia and China aren't really there. Of course, Russia and China were there. They had their foreign ministers there. They were just as important in all these other countries. But, and we don't really know why Xi Jinping didn't go. Lula was in China recently. Xi Jinping was in Brazil. They have really good relations. There were some people that were thinking it might have to do with Iran and what was happening kind of in the Middle East. And Xi Jinping kind of wanted to take a step back and not be directly there to have to make declarations and be involved in kind of the negotiating around different texts that might be in documents and things like that. But this is all speculation. We really don't know. But that was in the front end. The front end, that was, of course, what all the mainstream media was talking about. Oh, yeah, well, too bad for Lula. It's not going to be that great. And the day of and during the event, it was great. There was a lot of optimism, a lot of hope, a lot of excitement because at this moment in the world, right? What can we be hopeful and excited about, right? There's a genocide happening in Gaza, United States freaking bombing Iran, Israel, like what is happening that we can look towards and say, you know what? Yes, these people are taking the right path and this is exciting. So there was a lot of hope and excitement. It was interesting, like I mentioned before, that the press. So we heard what Lula said. We had very little access to the actual leaders of the delegations at the summit itself. So the summit was held at the Modern Art Museum in very close to downtown Rio. The press hall and the press center was kind of right next to it in the place called Vivo Rio, which is like this kind of big stadium. And so we could kind of get up on the balcony, do our lives, shoot down at like the cars as they're arriving, and then a small group of press pool from like the official photographers from all the different countries would then go and take the official pictures. But that was like the extent of our access. And so it meant that it was a little complicated for people that are looking to, like, for instance, for me to do packages that I was working on and do different stories. I was like contacting analysts that I knew that may not be inside the summit, that they're outside, and so I'd like jump out interviewing people outside and then jump back in and find out. So it was a complicated space to be able to work and develop packages where it's not just Lula speaking on the television, or like agency footage of like the BRICS people walking by and the leaders walking by and doing stuff. So like as press covering, it was a little complicated. But on the other hand, I, literally there was press from so many countries in the world, right? Like if you think of it, the fact that there were 26 countries at the event itself, then there were at least a couple of different stations or journalists from each of these different countries, and the press space was huge, it was massive, and there was so much attention, and that was really exciting. There were lives happening all the time, and it just shows again the importance of summits like this. Even if almost all the negotiating is happening behind tables, it's happening the year long beforehand with the Sherpas who are doing their thing. By the time you get to the summit, it's kind of like pomp and circumstance, but it still is huge because you focus all this international attention on this, and then the declaration comes out, and people are able to like look at what they're talking. And I think everyone's really kind of impressed with Lula's statements and his speeches, how much he kind of was pushing this urgency of right now we need this more than ever, and the world is kind of collapsing, and we are kind of the hope for that, but also pushing back against the genocide in Gaza and pushing back against the Trump's unilateral monetary measures and things like that. And he was very like he was not mincing words. And then when the declaration came out, people were really excited about what it had to say in the declaration. They were like, will they mention this? Will they mention that? Like, are they, because again, we're talking about a lot of different countries who have had to negotiate over a long period of time to come to these resolutions, and you're not sure what's actually like going to be on paper, or are all these different countries going to be on board with what's going to be on paper. But it was an exciting moment. I think what the declarations that came out of it was really good. People were extremely happy. And again, going back to this popular council, JG, the like that this was the first time they held like a forum like this before the summit itself. And so for academics and social movements, and for those folks who have been involved in this popular council over the last year, for them that was a really exciting moment of hope. And then kind of what does this mean going forward? So I really see I really see this BRICS summit in a lot of ways almost as a before and an after, right? BRICS has been important up until now, but this was the first one where you had all these countries involved. You had all the new partners, you had all the new associates, you had all these new observers, and then you had all, and it's happening right now in the world where it seems like everything's collapsing. This is the glimmer of hope that like we want to be able to look toward and go, you know what? Yeah, like I can see where this could be growing and developing even more into the future, and how this could really create change on an international level.
Closing out here, what do you think the biggest challenges are going forward for BRICS? And then maybe, if you can, you can promote your podcasts and other writings.
Great. Um, Biggest challenges. I mean, obviously, there's no doubt that the biggest challenge is the fact that you have 11, and then now with the new associate countries, another 10 countries from all across the world, multicultural, multi-language, and these are nations that some of them are conservative, some of them are more progressive, some of them are powerful, and some of them aren't. And so, how to bring all that together to continue to kind of develop, respecting everyone's sovereignty on a national level, but at the same time, trying to create processes where what's down on paper can actually be implemented. And that's the other challenge, I think, is they did an excellent job. The decorations look really good. One of the questions that I had was was from, and that I was speaking with this woman from the BRICS Policy Center, was great. Now they need to implement them. Now they need to take those steps to say, okay, we want to move toward this. We want to make this happen. We want to fight against climate change. And so that's another big challenge of they have their resolutions, they have their declarations to continue to push on those with all the different countries, because this is extremely diverse group of people, right? And so how do you do that on an international level? And it of course depends on the countries themselves, and it also depends on the international. So there's no doubt that that's a huge challenge. The other challenge, of course, is our friend Donald Trump, who is going to continue to push people around and continue to try and do what Trump does best. And so, that we can imagine what that might look like going forward. And the more that the BRICS countries try to develop new spaces for monetary exchange and new spaces for change, Trump's going to continue to push back. So I think that there's no doubt that this is like it's extremely exciting. They have many challenges ahead. But I think this is an important step forward that everyone needs to understand. And like you mentioned, I'm so glad you're doing this video, because it was like for a lot of people, what BRICS? What? Who is that? Why is this a big deal? Or you see it and you're like, oh yeah, there were even articles that talked about, oh yeah, Lula got snubbed, and like even after the summit was over, oh, because Russia and China didn't go. So it's like the BRICS nations know that they're going to have positive press, they're going to have negative press, and they just have to keep, you have to keep working forward, right? So I think it's exciting. My podcast, thank you for asking about it. Stories of Resistance, I launched it in January 20th this year, which of course was Inauguration Day. And the idea is they are just snippets, they're like vignettes to remind us all that these are hard times, these are dark times, but many people have been through dark and hard times before, and have fought and have stood up and have resisted. And so these stories of resistance look back at many of these different experiences, much of it in Latin America and the United States, and some of it's resistance against dictatorships in Latin America, or, for instance, the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, right? And so a lot of different experiences, moments. And the idea is I want to take you for 5, 6, 7 minutes a day, each of these episodes, and I want to kind of transport you in time to these spaces to give a little bit of inspiration in these kind of dark times. So this is my podcast right now that I'm rolling out with stories every week. My podcast Under the Shadow, which we did, the first season was last year. The second season will be next year. Looks at the role of the U.S. government abroad in Central America, the first season, in particularly in the 1980s. And I basically travel to places where things happened and then look at what the legacy is today, kind of walk in the footsteps of those ghosts and try and understand like what the United States policies in these regions, what they meant then and what they still mean today. And season 2 is going to look at Plan Condor, so South America. For the last year, I've been traveling around South America with my family to all the different countries and going to memorial sites and, interviewing people who were impacted by the dictatorships of these different countries and also have fought for justice now. And so again, I go to places where things happen and then make the connection to the US training, to the US support for kind of the dictatorships across the 1970s, and look at kind of what it all means today. So those are my two kind of latest podcasts. I have many more in the in the books. We'll see like when I'm able to roll them all out. But yes, and people can find those on The Real News, and people can check out my work at patreon.com/MFOX, which is kind of where I publish most of my things as well.
I forgot to ask this earlier, and it just crossed my mind, and I wanted to get it in here real quick. How likely do you think it is that, eventually Saudi Arabia gets off the fence and potentially joins BRICS?
Oh, how likely will they join? That's the
Yeah,
question.
do you think there's
Oh
a
yeah.
likelihood that they join BRICS? Because I know they're on the fence. At one point, they were going to join, but then they held off. And I'm just curious, where do you think Saudi Arabia may stand in a few years? Or do you think it's potential that they join? There's a
I think it's
potential.
yeah, I think there's absolutely a potential. I think, they obviously they were invited and there was interest in them going back and forth. I think it depends on how, global politics plays out in the next little bit and then their own country and how what's best for them, right? And particularly vis-a-vis the United States and where does that kind of play out? I have questions whether the United States is kind of pushing or prodding in certain directions to like convince Saudi Arabia either to join or to not. So, but I think it's absolutely possible. But we're gonna see so much of this stuff is so hard to tell, and that's like I mentioned the other thing at the summit itself. We heard Lula, we saw the declaration, uh, but like I wanted to hear what all these different countries are talking about. I was at my computer ready to listen to it all. I can't be in the room, but I'm here. This is going to be fantastic. And then they're like, okay, that was it. We'll let you know when Lula's going to speak again. I'm like, come on. Like, I wanted to hear what all these different nations had to say about this. And so part of this it's hard to tell kind of what's being played, and how different countries are trying to, push in one direction or another. And this goes back to that same challenge. Of course, that's like every country has its own kind of nationalist interests and it has its own international interests. And so I think in a lot of ways it's absolutely possible with Saudi Arabia, but we'll have to wait and see.
Well, hey, thanks again, Michael Fox, for coming on Parallax Views.
Thank you so much for having me, JG.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Darko, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mark M, Merisham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, JC, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.